Today I want to talk about Eric Knowles, who I term as a Wargaming original. Now, I think almost all Wargamers of my generation would cite Donald Featherstone, Brigadier Peter Young, Lieutenant Colonel Lawford and Charles Grant as being major influences on our development as Wargamers. In my own case, I later met Paddy Griffiths, who had a profound effect on me, particularly on my way of thinking about wargame design. But when it comes to enjoyable, fun wargaming, I really must tip my hat to Eric Knowles, and for reasons that will become apparent in this video. Now, this is one of the few pictures I can actually find of Eric, and you'll see him wearing his Inns of Court Regiment uniform. The Inns of Court at the time were an armoured car reconnaissance regiment, and Eric served in the Territorial Army in that regiment, certainly up until it converted into a Royal Signals Regiment later in the 1960s. He began working in the Daily Mirror in the research department, and he remained there until he took early retirement, when he bought one of the few wargame shops in London, Wall Models Ltd, which was in East Ham. He later renamed it the New Model Army, and it was after it was renamed that I got to meet him. I visited his shop on many occasions to buy wargames figures, books, etc., and eventually got to know him incredibly well. But again, that's the heart of the story that we'll come to later in this video. Now, the first reference I can find to Eric Knowles as a wargamer is in the famous 1965 Battle of Waterloo refight that took place at the Duke of York's headquarters in London. This was to mark the 150th anniversary of the battle, and you'll see here some pages, or parts of pages, taken from the Wargames newsletter that was published, that contained a very long article about this particular refight. And you'll see that Eric's name is listed as being Lieutenant General Sir Thomas Picton. That was the role he took on in the battle, and when you read the report, he did incredibly well. He actually held Hougoumont and then used it as a base from which to advance against the French, and eventually ended up on the French ridgeline. Very much differently from the accounts of what actually happened in the real battle. Unfortunately, the wargame ended before he was able to exploit his success, because he just did not have enough troops to do so. I have some photographs of that refight here, and it's absolutely amazing when you look at it to see a crowd of people round the table watching the action as it takes place. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen anything like this, even in a modern wargame show. Some of the people taking part were well known, very well known in the wargames world at the time, and remain so to those of us with longish memories. In the left-hand photograph, you can see on the left Neville Dickinson, who founded Miniature Figurines the year before this refight took place. And on the right, in glasses, you can see Tony Bath, who went on to found the Society of Ancients in 1965. On the right-hand photograph, you can see the entire table, and actually, over on the right-hand side, wearing his uniform of the Inns of Court Regiment, you can see Eric. Once he took over Wall Models and then renamed it New Model Army, Eric's figures, or at least some of the figures from Eric's collections, huge collections, were used in film and television productions. The one that really sticks in my mind is the Four Feathers remake from 1978. This starred Beau Bridges, Robert Powell, Simon Ward, Jane Seymour and Harry Andrews, and you can actually see Harry Andrews here talking to the young Harry Faversham in the role of his father, General Faversham. Now, Eric's figures, Napoleonic figure collection, consisted of a mixture of Hinchliffe and also Hinton Hunts, and those are very distinctive Hinton Hunt Lancers on the right hand photograph. Later on, after this film was made, I actually had the opportunity to buy some of the figures from Eric's collections, which I did, and it is my great regret that I was eventually prevailed upon by a Swiss collector to sell them, and looking back, it's probably one of the worst decisions I ever made in wargaming. His figures were also used in the film of the book Charlie Muffin, which was also known as The Deadly Game when it was released in America. And Charlie Muffin was a reaction, I suppose, to the Bond-style Secret Service agent. He was a scruffy man who wore a dirty raincoat, didn't do his tie-up and so on, was very much out of kilter with the rest of the Secret Service. Charlie Muffin himself was played by David Hemmings, and the remainder of the cast included Ralph Richardson, Sam Wanamaker, Pincus Brown, Ian Richardson, Shane Rimmer and Jenny Linden. Pincus Brown played Charlie Muffin's main opponent, a Russian general who enjoyed fighting war games, and you can see him here at his war games table. Now, in the book, the general was actually refighting the Battle of Kursk, a battle he'd taken part in as a younger man, and this is an ongoing project that had been taking a long time for him to refight. In the film, this is quite obviously not the Battle of Kursk. It is a Second World War battle set up on a tabletop using stuff from Eric's World War II collections. But it's a bit of a mishmash, and features a very large overscale model of General Zhukov standing next to what looks like a Sherman tank. As I said, this was a made-for-TV film, and therefore realism in terms of wargaming probably wasn't uttermost in their minds. I did ask Eric how much he made from lending his collections out. He was a very canny man, and I doubt if it wasn't unremunerative, but he never actually told me how much he made. He was also a wargame designer, and probably his greatest wargame design was the Quest for Thane Tostig, which was a fantasy role-play tabletop game played with figures designed by the great designer Barry Minnow. And actually, in the basement of New Model Army, the figures were cast in a casting room which formed one end of the basement. A funny story is that I remember seeing Eric at a wargame show. I think it might have been Salute, and they'd obviously been doing a lot of casting of figures, and he had them still on the casting sprues. And one of the figures had not cast very well. Instead of coming out properly, it came out very misshapen and blobby, and he was actually cutting these off and throwing them in a box. And a wargamer came up and said, "Oh, excuse me, what are they?" pointing at these miscast figures, and Eric, quick as a flash, said, "Oh, they're swamp creatures. How much are they?" And Eric quoted a price, and the bloke bought the lot. So rather than going back into the melting pot, he sold them. And that was the sort of person that Eric was. Very, very quick on the mark, off the mark to make a buck if he could do. But anyway, the Quest for Thane Tostig, it enjoyed a certain sort of, not notoriety, but a certain degree of support. And I know there are still very popular with some wargamers out there in the fantasy world because of its excellence. Now, I met, as I said, Eric at his shop, and I was invited by him to take part in what really became the very famous Madasahatta Campaign. And I spent well over a year with a group of other wargamers, some of whom are bloggers like me, and many of whom are members of the South East Essex Military Society, fighting a colonial campaign set on the island of Madasahatta, which is sort of occupies a position not far from Madagascar. The left-hand map here is one that we used for the original game, and the right-hand map here is one that I redrew a few years ago for the book that I published about the Madasahatta campaign. I decided to do this not long after Eric died in 2017, really as my way of saying thank you to him. I did it more for his family and for the close group of friends that took part, but surprisingly it's actually sold reasonably well for such a niche book. And even now I go back and reread it and think, boy, that was a great campaign, probably the best campaign I ever took part in, and one of the most enjoyable, fun experiences I've ever had in wargaming. So that, very briefly, is my story of Eric Knowles. As I said, he died in 2017. He sold his shop and retired with his wife Ivy up to Lincolnshire. And being a very active man, he didn't just sort of give up. He's carried on wargaming, creating huge wargames armies. In fact, going to his house was a bit of an event, because everywhere you went there were cupboards full of wargames figures. I mean, I even remember going to the bathroom in his house in London and being amazed to find that in the airing cupboard there were boxes and boxes and boxes of wargames figures. He was a great adapter. He wanted some Belgian light tanks for a Belgian World War II army, 1940s, and he cobbled together sort of vague lookalikes from what he could get. And actually they looked quite convincing. Bits of airfix kits, bits of Roco tanks and so on. But that was Eric. He was a great innovator, a great wargamer, and I miss him tremendously. I hope you've enjoyed this brief remembrance of Eric. As I said, he was a wargaming original. He was one of the earlier wargamers in the UK, and he left an indelible mark with everybody in wargaming who met him. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to this channel. There'll be more videos along in the very near future, and I hope you'll watch them and enjoy them. In the meantime, enjoy your wargaming. I certainly do.